Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this panel. I'm incredibly excited to be joined by some of the leading minds and advocates of liberty today to try to answer the question, what can save us from big government? To begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists and then start prompting them with questions to answer that. We have John Allison, President and CEO of the Cato Institute. Mr. Allison, prior to joining Cato, was Chairman and CEO of the BB&T Corporation, the 10th largest financial services holding company headquartered in the United States. During his tenure as CEO from 1989 to 2008, BB&T grew from $4.5 billion to $152 billion in assets. He has received the Cumming Award for the Distinguished Leadership, been inducted into the North Carolina Business Hall of Fame, and received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Banker. Next to Mr. Allison, we have P.J. O'Rourke, libertarian commentator and humorist. P.J. O'Rourke was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, and attended Miami University and Johns Hopkins. He began writing funny things in the 1960s underground newspapers, became editor-in-chief of National Lampoon, then spent 20 years reporting for Rolling Stone and the Atlantic Monthly as the world's only trouble spot humorist, going to wars, riots, rebellions, and other holidays in hell in more than 40 countries. He has written 16 books on subjects as diverse as politics and cars and etiquette and economics. Mr. P.J. O'Rourke. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Charles Murray, W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and the noted author of such books as The Bell Curve, What It Means to be a Libertarian, and Coming Apart. Please welcome Mr. Murray. I want to begin by contextualizing this panel because it's somewhat interesting that we have to ask the question whether we can stop big government. Because it was only 20 years ago that a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, said that the era of big government was over. We had defeated the Soviet Union. We had protected civil liberties or civil rights in the 1960s, achieved women's suffrage in the early 20th century, and yet we see threats to liberty on all sides today. Our national debt in the United States is higher than it's ever been before. People are forced to purchase goods whether they decide they want to or not. The government routinely discriminates against people because of their sexual orientation and imprisons others for nonviolent drug offenses. And at the same time, we have to fear the American government going to war everywhere from the Ukraine because of the actions of Russia's President Putin to Iraq once again as we've just left the country from a war we initiated over a decade ago. So I want to begin by asking each panelist before what the strategy is for how we can stop big government. Can we actually do so, given all of the threats we're facing today? Let's begin by going right to left with Mr. Allison.
Thank you, Alexander. Good pleasure to be here. I think we can, or I wouldn't be working for Cato. I will go ahead and suggest a strategy because I don't think you can answer that question without some context. And I think the strategy has four fundamental components. First, I think we have to be very engaged in the philosophical fight. And I think that is the real underlying fight that's going on in the United States today. On one side, the collectivists, the statists. On the other side, those of us that believe in the principles that made America great, individual rights, free markets, limited government. We must be willing to defend those ideas philosophically and particularly defend the concept that each of us has a moral right to our own lives. Secondly, we've got to have policies that help us get from where we are to where we want to be. In some cases, we can't make that leap. We've got to move in incrementally, and that's exactly how the progressive took us to where we are today. That's a lot of what we do at Cato. How do we move from where we are to where we ought to be with policies as these government policies fail? The third thing we ought to do, I believe, is we need to prepare for a crisis. The interesting fact is that big government doesn't work. It's failed, it's failed, it's failed. We will have some kind of financial crisis. My own personal opinion is it may be 10 to 15 years down the road, not next week. And I think it will be driven mathematically by the demographics of the retirement of the baby boomer generation. And interestingly enough, that creates an opportunity. If you look at radical change, either negatively or positively, it's largely around crises. If you saw the Thatcher Revolution in the UK, it was around a crisis. And so one of the things we need to do today is plant the ideas that when that crises come, move us in the right direction to a freer and more prosperous society. And finally, and this relates to, in a way, to Alexander's work, but on a broader plane, we need to really get involved in the education process at the university level, but I think even at a deeper level. If you look at why we've gotten to where we are, I think it's primarily because the state has controlled the universities, and through that they control the schools because they educate the teachers. And not only are they indoctrinating students in bad ideas, they're not teaching students how to think critically. And we need critical thinkers. And I'm not talking about IQ, but people that can make decisions, because we basically have logical arguments. And here's where I have a lot of hope. Interestingly enough, I think we're at the verge of an educational revolution. It's going to be driven by a combination of technology, which can radically cut the cost, and I think equally important, curriculum improvement. Curriculum improvement that helps people learn how to make decisions, and when people can think critically and make decisions, they naturally want control of their lives, and they assume a high level of personal responsibility. So the creation of a free market in education, for-profit, unregulated schools, which will do to the public school systems what UPS and FedEx did to the post office, I think it will happen. And that's how we ultimately win the game. When our ideas are introduced to people that can think, they don't have to be indoctrinated, but can think from themselves, that can judge rationally the facts, we have the ideas that lead to a free and prosperous society, which is what everybody wants to have. So that's a strategy to ensure that we do, in fact, roll back government.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. Mr. O'Rourke?
Let's see, what should I use mics? Well, I got to take a slightly more negative view. I think we've got one of our worst problems with this is that we can't vote our way out of it. And the reason we can't vote our way out of it is because of what's called public choice economics, is that everybody wants to get paid. It's just not everybody wants to get paid in the same medium. Sensible people, like I would imagine most of the people in this room, like to get paid in money. Nothing wrong with that. Money's perfectly neutral. Can be used for good, can be used for evil, can be used for things that are perfectly neutral. But there are people out there that want to be paid in another way. Maybe they want fame, and maybe they want sainthood, maybe they want self-esteem. But most dangerous among them is people who want to be paid in power. And if you draw a Venn diagram of politicians and people who want to be paid in power, they ain't no part of the politician circle that in any way gets outside that Venn diagram. And so it doesn't matter how good a guy we vote for, he's going to be corrupted by the thing he wants to be paid in. And so government won't go away that way. As John was saying, we face a huge demographic problem as our population is aging, and 70-some million of the citizens in the United States are coming into the dependency years. It's going to be very hard to get rid of government. They're not going to vote to cut their own benefits. Nobody votes against free popcorn at the movies. It's just, you know, something that we have to face. Then we have a very cynical political establishment that has been for more than 100 years now, since the time of Teddy Roosevelt, gradually building public dependence upon government. You could even go so far back as to say that free public schooling was maybe the first step in this direction. Maybe you know, building public roads was the first step. But at any rate, it's really, since FDR particularly, it has really accelerated. And we're getting close to that tipping point where more than half of Americans, if we're not there now. John would probably have the figures on this better than I do. We're very close to having 50% of Americans